So did you know that in 2023 that China launched a satellite with the capability to capture and manipulate other satellites? So are we really prepared to defend against the growing threat of space weapons that can target our assets? Good afternoon. I'm Stephen St. John, currently working as a SkillBridge Aerospace and Defense Program Management Fellow at the University of Tennessee Space Institute here in Huntsville. I have 22 years of experience in the Air Force and Space Force, managing missile warning and experimental satellites. My background also includes electromagnetic warfare, controlling nuclear ICBMs, and providing some tailored intelligence analysis to both special operations and senior space leaders. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how space is absolutely critical to everything that we do on a daily basis and why we had to have a dedicated Space Force to ensure that we could protect it. We also dove into how the Space Force uses its assets, how it maintains space superiority, and how it continues to innovate to stay ahead of that game. We also looked at how the branch is organized and why having a specialized workforce is necessary to national defense in space. So before we get started, I have two quick asks. First, please hold any questions you have until the Q&A or drop them in the chat so that we don't miss anything. And also, please remember that this is an unclassified academic environment. So if we can't answer specific questions, it's likely because of classification level issues and things like that. So let's go ahead and start with a real quick 2-minute video that discusses some of the implications of a potential arms race in space, and then I will pull on that thread a little bit more throughout the brief.
Anxieties over a new arms race in space. Courtney Kuby has rare access inside an Alabama facility on the front lines, guarding the U.S. against threats from China in orbit.
Growing tensions between the U.S. and China now extending to hundreds of miles above the Earth.
We know when we're threatened. We need to be able to counter the threat.
To get an inside look at some of the latest American technology to counter the Chinese threat, we went to United Launch Alliance's factory in Alabama, working on defenses against things like Chinese satellites that can use robotic arms to drag other satellites out of orbit, meaning China could disable critical American communications satellites.
They were actually able to grab a hold of one of their defunct GPS or BeiDou satellites.
What is the concern about them having that kind of capability in space?
Anything that can interact with a spacecraft for servicing is inherently capable of interacting with the spacecraft to harm it or to gather intelligence from it.
And fears tonight that China is moving faster than the U.S. in this new space race, including not just in space, but the skies just above us, not only using satellites, but spy balloons and hypersonic missiles.
When you look at the threat from China in space right now, what concerns you the most?
We seem to be asleep at the switch.
Dean Chang is an expert on China's space program, which has more than doubled in the past 5 years.
Do you think that China militarily is ahead of the U.S. in space?
I think the Chinese are giving us a real good run for the money.
He says another potential Chinese threat to the U.S. from space includes a cyber attack that allows China to remotely take control of an American satellite.
You could say to the satellite, deorbit, come crashing down. And there goes $1 billion payload crashing into the Pacific.
Or disrupt American missile defense systems.
The really scary one, of course, is if you could spoof missile early warning systems so that they don't report a missile launch. That's the ultimate night.
U.S. officials tell NBC News China can already do both. And
okay, so I gave you a little quick overview of potential space arms race, right? So these are the different things that we're going to cover today, and I'll go more in depth on all of these as we go through the brief. So let's first start out with what's changing in space. So in recent years, China and Russia have both expanded their involvement in space both for exploration and military purposes. China has rapidly advanced its space program, developing new satellites, a space station, and various anti-satellite weapons to position itself as a major competitor to the United States. Russia also continues to enhance its space military capabilities, including, excuse me, including anti-satellite technologies, advanced space surveillance to support those weapons. All of these actions, they highlight that space has become increasingly congested, contested, and competitive, which really has implications for global power and security. Additionally, over the last few years, satellite constellation design has been shifting away from a few really large, highly capable satellites to more of a large proliferated network of smaller, less expensive satellites. And in this change, it really just allows for more coverage, resilience, and faster deployment while still providing essential capabilities. But with that, there comes more risk. So also space weapons proliferation has increased. This includes technologies like high power microwaves that can disrupt satellite electronics, radio frequency jammers that can block communications, lasers that can disrupt sensors, chemical sprayers to degrade systems, kinetic kill vehicles to destroy satellites, and robotic mechanisms for physical manipulation or disabling of other satellites, all of which pose increasing threats to space infrastructure and security. Lastly, competitors can mask space weapons or reconnaissance assets as peaceful technologies by presenting them as scientific or even commercial tools. So for example, a Russian spacecraft called Cosmos 2558 was launched into the same orbital plane as the US satellite USA 326, which the Pentagon has said is meant to support overhead reconnaissance. So according to public observation, though, Cosmos 2558 made multiple close passes with USA 326 and has come within 31 miles of its American target, which is not nearly enough to risk any kind of collision, but it is close enough to probably get some detailed imagery of the satellite. This image that you're seeing on the screen right now is just an example of just how much detail an inspector satellite might be able to capture when photographing a target. This example is from Maxar satellite, which usually images the surface of the Earth, but it took this photo as it flew past a discarded piece of Japanese rocket body in orbit. So you can only imagine how this type of fidelity of imagery could be used to gain some powerful insight into on-orbit technology. So now that you have some idea of what's changing in the space domain and how it's rapidly changing, let's look at some specific technologies used to disrupt, deny, degrade, and destroy space assets. Okay, what we'll do is we'll dive into some elements of Counterspace from a high level, and then we will talk about specific capabilities as we continue. Counterspace refers to actions that are taken to interfere with or neutralize an adversary's space assets. These operations, they're really key to gaining a strategic advantage in the modern military strategy. So let's just go ahead and walk through some of these, and I'll help you visualize what that might look like. Okay, electronic warfare. This uses electromagnetic energy to disrupt or damage enemy electronics, such as communications and radar systems. So in space, it targets satellite communications, GPS, and other sensors that play a crucial role in military operations. So what you're seeing here in this animation is two geographically separated users communicating via satellite. Brute force jamming involves disrupting or blocking that communication signal between the satellite and its ground stations or other satellites. This is typically done by broadcasting a powerful radio frequency signal on the same frequency by the target satellite, thus overwhelming the satellite's receiver with noise. That jamming signal then prevents the satellite transponder from receiving its intended data and effectively causing interference for the users. These threats disrupt military operations, but this is not isolated to military communication satellites. This could be used against commercial capabilities to create public panic as well. So I don't know if you knew this, but every time you go to the gas station and you swipe your credit card, it sends a signal over a very small aperture terminal to a satellite. And then that satellite then relays that down to your credit card company. They make sure that your bill's paid, you're able to charge that purchase, and they let the gas station know, right? So what would it be like if you couldn't use your credit card for everyday purchases anywhere, right? Do you think that would create some mass chaos or run on banks, things like that? All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, directed energy weapons. So this uses concentrated energy such as lasers or microwaves to damage or disable target sensors. So in space, directed energy weapons could be used to disrupt satellites by blinding their sensors, damaging their electronics, or even physically destroying those satellites. The advantage is that these weapons offer very precise and rapid and potentially cost-effective methods of targeting multiple satellites. So let me kind of help you visualize that with an animation. Okay. What you're seeing here is a ground-based high-powered laser that can dazzle or blind imagery satellites by directing a concentrated beam of intense light at its target or optical sensors. So you see the airplanes there in the picture. That's what a good collection might look like. This disrupts the sensor by temporarily overpowering them, causing glare or permanently damaging their components. So as a result, the satellite can no longer capture those clear images or perform its reconnaissance duties for just long enough to not be able to monitor a specific target. And now you see the planes are gone, right? So bad collect. Okay, now let's talk about orbital threats. So this includes anti-satellite weapons, space debris, hostile satellites that can interfere with, damage, or even destroy operational satellites. These threats really can pose a risk to both military and civilian space assets. So what you're seeing in the bottom left, you're seeing an inset graphic that's highlighting some rendezvous and proximity operations or orbital maneuvers the Chinese satellite did before to capture another satellite and tug it into a different orbital position about 1,800 miles above its original altitude. And we'll talk about that more later. But this really involves carefully navigating the satellite to approach the target satellite in a controlled manner, requiring that precise maneuvering to ensure it safely gets close enough. But once in position, like you're seeing right now, it can then use its robotic arms, magnetic tethers, or other mechanisms to physically latch onto that target satellite. And from there, it can apply force and move that satellite to a different orbit. Now that that missile warning satellite is unable to monitor the area for a missile launch, our ability to notify, make decisions, and possibly even intercept that missile has decreased significantly. Moving on. So kinetic energy weapons. So using physical projectiles or kinetic kill vehicles to collide with and destroy targets, such as satellites. These weapons, they really rely on high velocity of the projectile to cause damage without the need for explosives. All right, so what you're seeing here is a direct descent anti-satellite weapon that's targeting and destroying a GPS satellite by launching a missile. The missile tracked and intercepted the satellite, causing complete destruction. And now you can see on the right-hand side, you don't have GPS signal anymore. That same signal that's required for aircraft, ships, and for you to get to Starbucks in the morning. Direct descent anti-satellite weapons, they can reach low Earth orbit, which is 1,200 miles and less, in about 4 to 8 minutes. But that would take to get to GEO, which is around that 22,000 miles where a lot of our high value assets reside. That'll take about 4 to 8 hours to reach that point. There have been several direct descent anti-satellite tests in LEO with notable tests by China, Russia, and the US, but no confirmed test targeting GEO. So now let's look at how China doctrinally intends to employ some of these types of systems. All right, China's counterspace doctrine, it emphasizes potential disruption of adversary space assets in order to enhance its own space capabilities and limit those of its rivals. This strategy is really grounded in China's recognition of space as a critical domain for both military and economic operations. This counterspace, though, as an approach, forms part of China's broader military strategy of aiming to create an anti-access area denial environment in the region to ensure that adversaries, they face significant challenges in using space during any kind of conflict. China's electronic warfare systems, they're both fixed and mobile. They can disrupt satellite communications, navigation signals, and intelligence satellites. One example of this is the GPS interference that was caused by Chinese warships back in 2023, which affected commercial airliners in the Indo-Pacific region. The specific incident, though, it occurred when Chinese naval vessels deployed GPS jammers in the South China Sea, which is really a strategically sensitive area where multiple countries, including China, have territorial disputes. This event, though, is not isolated. And in fact, it's part of a broader pattern where GPS jamming is becoming more widespread, especially in areas of strategic importance. Next, China has multiple ground-based laser weapons. They're capable of blinding or damaging satellite sensors. One example is in May of 2023, a US imagery satellite operator detected laser activity at China's Coriolis test site, suggesting laser anti-satellite capabilities. The Coriolis test site is known for being a significant facility for China's missile and space programs and has previously been associated with testing various defense technologies. Moving on, China also has ground-based direct descent anti-satellite missile systems, but they have refrained from any additional destructive satellite test since its 2007 interception of a defunct weather satellite in low Earth orbit. Despite this, though, it's China's thought to have continued that development and conducting non-destructive tests of direct descent anti-satellite weapons capable of reaching higher orbits, including geostationary orbit. Now on to their dual-use technology. China has been increasingly conducting unusual and sophisticated rendezvous and proximity operations with its satellites, particularly in geostationary orbit. The Xi'an-21 satellite demonstrated its stated purpose of space debris mitigation in 2022 when it captured and maneuvered a defunct satellite to the graveyard orbit, which is what I talked about earlier, and then it returned itself back to the geostationary orbit. Now that we talked a little bit about China, let's touch on some of Russia's counterspace capabilities. Okay, so space is central to Russia's military strategy, really with a focus on countering US space capabilities to disrupt their air, or our air and missile operations. Russia's strategic aerospace operations, they really aim to degrade or destroy the adversary's space assets early in a conflict and even possibly before hostilities even begin. Russia has also suggested that Western quasi-civilian satellites, including US commercial systems, could be legitimate targets. Okay, it's no secret that Russia has employed jamming technologies such as interference with GPS signals across Europe and Ukraine. Recently, GPS interference has been reported in Poland, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and it continues in Ukraine. Additionally, in 2023, the European Space Agency Sentinel-1 synthetic aperture radar satellite experienced interference while it was imaging Sevastopol, likely from a Russian electronic warfare system. Furthermore, non-kinetic weapons can be a game changer when it comes to space-based defensive and offensive capabilities. PRSVET is a Russian laser system that was publicly unveiled back in 2018. It's been reportedly designed as a mobile, ground-based, directed energy weapon that is intended to be used primarily for defensive space assets. The system's believed to have some capability to disable or degrade satellites in a low Earth orbit using that high-powered laser. Russia also has direct descent anti-satellite missile technology. The Noodle is a ground-based system designed to target and destroy satellites in low Earth orbit. The Noodle has been under development since the 2000s, and it's part of Russia's broader effort to strengthen its counterspace capabilities. The system's missile is launched from the ground, kind of like you saw in the animation. It's designed to intercept and destroy a satellite in low Earth orbit. The Noodle has been tested multiple times with reports of successful test back in 2021 when it struck Cosmos 1408, which is a Russian satellite, and it created a debris field in low Earth orbit, as you kind of see on the graphic to the right. When this occurred, the onboard ISS crew had to take shelter in their escape capsules for the first few passes because they didn't know how the debris cloud was going to propagate. This test generated more than 1,500 pieces of trackable orbital debris. So when I say trackable, think the size of like a softball. but likely generated hundreds of thousands of pieces of smaller debris that could damage satellites as well. The exact number of tests and operational status of Noodle remains unclear and has not yet been confirmed as fully operational. Russia's nesting doll satellites, they refer to a series of satellites that are launched by Russia that are designed to be deployed one inside of another, similar to like a wooden Russian nesting doll that you've seen before. These satellites are part of a larger strategy to create complex space systems for various purposes, including military and surveillance applications. These types of satellites are seen as a way to make more asymmetric, compact, flexible, cost-effective space systems with potential military applications and reducing attribution as well. All right, okay, now let's talk about some of the things that I see trending in the environment. All right. Normalization of defiance. What does that mean? So that refers to the gradual process by which unacceptable practices, behaviors, or risks they become accepted over time because they're not met with immediate results that are negative consequences. So when looking at normalization of defiance in the context of space behaviors by China and Russia, it becomes evident that their growing aggressiveness in space to include anti-satellite tests, electronic warfare, those sophisticated rendezvous and proximity operations I talked about, and just their overall militarization of space is setting up a dangerous precedent for space security and international relations. Space surveillance, we're talking about counterspace here, right? So space surveillance both enables counterspace operations and it also helps detect and attribute counterspace operations, such as activities like anti-satellite tests, potential space weapon deployments, or suspicious satellite maneuvers, which could indicate some kind of hostile intent. Both terrestrial and orbital space surveillance capabilities will continue to exponentially grow in the future as they are critical to counterspace operations. Okay. Also, many commercial space assets, such as communication satellites and Earth observation platforms that support both the military and civilian use. Those adversaries are starting to view those as dual-use targets, given their potential utility in military operations. So as more commercial entities become integral to that global communications and defensive operations, there is going to be an increasing need for cybersecurity and resilience. And these private players, they're often less protected than government entities might be, and they probably lack some of the resources to counter advanced cyber threats as well. So something we need to think about in the future. Okay, finally, the moment you have all been waiting for. It's really my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Lieutenant Colonel John Vincent. He's the commander of the 74th Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Squadron in the Space Force. Lieutenant Colonel Vincent, first off, I just want to thank you for being here. I highlighted a few moments on your career on the slide, but it doesn't really fully reflect the extent of your achievements. But I'd like to open up this session with a couple questions to get things started, and then we can go from there, if that sounds okay.
Of course, yeah. Hey, thanks so much, Trench, for having me here today. Fantastic brief. I think that really got into a good overview of kind of what we're dealing with day in and day out. My squadron in particular looks at adversary techniques and procedures to kind of understand what they're doing in the orbital domain and to a certain extent terrestrial as well. So of vital importance and things that we're caring about kind of every single day. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. First question that I got for you, is a few questions that we got kind of like tie into this, but what really inspired you to pursue a career in space program management? And then how did that transition to space intelligence?
Sure, absolutely. So Back in 2008, I was just about to commission, and I knew space was going to be growing in that industry and of importance kind of throughout the globe. And then in 2007, right before I commissioned, we saw, as you mentioned, China's first DAA sat, direct descent anti-satellite test, which created a dramatic orbital debris field there. And what I think really kicked off, which a lot of people didn't know at the time, what really kicked off the next kind of space race that we're still seeing the effects of today. And so that drove me to want to get into that business. And so I went and helped work at the Space Development Test Wing there at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and was able to work on some really unique, smaller capabilities, test platform capabilities, and kind of got my first taste of space there. And then that kind of led me into the intelligence field. And I branched out and did some AFSOC stuff, much like you did. And then kind of came back to the National Air and Space Intelligence Center and got back into that space world, specifically looking at all the counterspace capabilities that our adversaries have out there. And so I've been doing the space business and counterspace analysis for quite a while. And it was just kind of a direct translation to going over into the Space Force and really helping set things up in late 2020, 2021, as we really started to stand up the Space Operations Command and really start to get after understanding our adversaries and their capabilities in space. Over.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, I mean, obviously you have a wide breadth of experience, and again, you bring a perspective that really I can't provide here. So, from a lot of the things that you've done, so I'll give you another question though, right? So, this is more so to like what you guys are doing right now at the 74th. So, what aspects of the space domain, along with like the capabilities of our strategic competitors, what are those concern you most or keep you up at night?
Great question. So I think as you mentioned, kind of hinted at during this briefing, everything that we do is just underpinned by our ability to get into space and use space. It's of just vital national importance that we have access to space. Whether you said like you said, using the GPS to get to your favorite Starbucks every single day, or ATM transactions, global communications, which are about to get quite a bit more globally space kind of oriented with Apple's integration of Starlink with their T-Mobile stuff. So we're going to be talking at the civilian level, global satellite communications that have not been available like we've ever seen before. And then, of course, on the military side, and what our adversaries have always seen us is that, we are now completely dependent on space. The PRC were definitely watching way back in '91, which a lot of people call the very first space war, or space-enabled war, I should say, in the Gulf, and how much we used GPS, how much we used satellite communications to be able to go in there and decisively eliminate an adversary in that warfighting domain. And ever since then, that has kind of kicked off what they have seen as kind of our Achilles heel. And as they have grown as well, they've become more dependent on it, but their capabilities, whether that's from direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, terrestrial-based satellite jamming, orbital satellite jamming, directed energy counterspace weapons, cyber counterspace weapons, and space-based grappling counterspace weapons. We've just seen them push the envelope to, I think, heights that we didn't expect way back in 2007. And the obfuscation that they're using as dual use, I think if you're not in this business every single day looking at that, then a lot of their dual use technology can kind of be missed as they're just trying to help clean up orbit, or they're just trying to refuel their satellites. And so I think that is not probably getting the attention that it should be getting. And so that's of strategic importance to us. Over.
Yeah, I mean, those are some of the same things that, I think about too at night of like, how can we make sure that we are prepared for any kind of aggression from our adversaries in the space domain, and how space really underpins everything we do as a joint force in the multi-domain fashion, right? And so that was a fantastic answer. I know 74th is getting after some of that stuff though, so I can sleep a little bit better at night knowing that you're at the helm, and we got some good guardians over there trying to do the analysis that's going to protect us. Sure. All right, so I will open it up to questions from the audience for probably about 10-ish minutes before Colonel Vincent has to get to cut a ribbon on a new building so that his guardians can have some physical space to actually be working in. Which will help with that analysis and threat application. So if there's any questions, feel free to either type them in the chat or just go ahead and come online and you can ask those questions. But again, remember, this is an unclassified academic environment, okay?
Yeah, and as we're waiting for questions to come up, you mentioned our new building. And so a lot of the space domain is still kind of veiled in the top secret and other classification levels, which makes it pretty difficult to talk about a lot of the capabilities that our adversary has. And in the space world, we are really trying to be able to operate in a level that we can collaborate with each other. As we talk at different classification levels, it makes things difficult to partner with and get after the problem set. Get question here.
I think if you all want me to read that, so it seems Colleen has a question. How can we better educate the general public on the importance of this topic?
Yeah, I can
go for it.
Go ahead.
No, Trench, go for it, man.
Okay, so I'll take it real quick and you can, expound on it. But I think it's opportunities like this right here, right? So getting in front of the right people and making sure that we're advocating and educating people on what the Space Force is and that it was needed. Again, like I said last week, this isn't an idea that was, generated 5 years ago. When I came in 22 years ago, we were talking about needing a Space Corps, right? And that threat over those 22 years has just continued to grow. And so I think getting out and telling people more about what the Space Force is doing and what that threat looks like. And I think a big piece of that too, that senior leaders are talking about right now, is how do you start to bring classification down of a lot of these things, right? So that people, the general public, can understand what other countries are doing and their malicious activities. And so, there's one thing that I like to say sometimes, right, is like when you start talking about our capabilities and stuff like that. So, you reveal to deter and you conceal to win, right? And so there's things that you can bring out to make sure that the adversary knows you have that capability, but there's also things that you want to make sure that you hold tight so that if you are in a conflict, you have that ace in your back pocket, right, to win that fight. So Colonel Vince, I don't know if you want to add on that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I was just going to actually plug you, guys like you with your background, getting out into institutions like this for people who care about this type of thing are, fantastic ways to continue to spread that word. I think that when Congressman Turner kind of came out, I believe it was in the middle of last year, with some pretty damning evidence against Russia and some of the capabilities that they had, that got everybody spun up. And I think the IC, the intelligence community, was a little surprised with how much he kind of revealed during that, to kind of let the public know the capabilities that are in space right now, or potentially in space. And so I think that we need more of that for sure.
Agreed. Next question I see is, to what level are we concerned about corruption of satellite communication? So like fake messaging, as opposed to simple blocking or brute force disruption.
Very, yeah. So that is something that I know. All the units that I work with on the blue capability sides are always tracking. I know cyber threats are of significant importance. When the Space Force stood up and Space Operations Command stood up, they specifically stood up Delta 6, which is the cyberspace delta that is looking into how we defend our satellites in space. And so that is of key importance to all of us. And even within the 74th, we have cyber intel analysts to identify some of the techniques that our adversaries use to be able to try to infiltrate and potentially corrupt some of our satellites. Over.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Getting you a couple more questions before you gotta get out of here, but how does Counterspace change from LEO to GEO to cislunar? What are your thoughts on that?
Fantastic question. And I think it's a multi-part answer. So in LEO, I think that we are seeing a lot more proliferated architectures, which is going to make any kind of attacks on a LEO capability much less impactful. If you're going to spend the money and the time to launch a direct ascent ASAT weapon, you just to LEO, you're not going to probably impact the constellation as much. And so that's why not only the US, but our adversaries are turning to a more proliferated capability. However, in LEO, our space domain awareness there is very good. In GEO, the space domain capability is probably not as good just because it's a lot farther out there. However, we don't have as many systems. There's no proliferated GEO systems like we have in LEO, or about to have in LEO. And so your bang for the buck to be able to take out one of those capabilities is different. Your kind of gain loss is quite a bit different. And then as we get out to cislunar, the ability to see that far out there, especially with some of the smaller stuff, is extremely difficult. And the capabilities that we have that far out there are almost non-existent. And so I think as technologies increase, our ability to get out there to some of the Lagrange points and cislunar will be of more importance. But right now, that's kind of where we're at.
All right, I think we got time for maybe one more. So how
Yeah,
important?
For sure.
Yeah, how important is monitoring space weather conditions? So we're talking, particles, CMEs for the Space Force. Can space weather disturbances look like an action from the adversary?
Yeah, great question. So every time the space crew operators step to mission, they usually get an update on how the space weather is looking. Anytime that there is an anomaly on a satellite, we usually look to space weather to see if that's the main cause of that anomaly. And oftentimes it is. And so it does play a pretty big effect on some of the stuff that we do, but we do have pretty hardened systems that are up there that are not affected by it. As we go and proliferate those LEO constellations, that kind of remains to be seen how it's going to affect that type of stuff. Whether or not the adversary can spoof space weather right now is I think kind of remains to be seen. But I mean, that always goes into the root cause analysis on anomalies for the satellites if we think it was nefarious or space weather. Over.
Yeah, like you said, a lot of our systems we've put so much money into them to make sure that they're hardened against some of those perturbations that are out there. However, you look at like a case study like Starlink, right? And they just go really fast and they get capability up there now, and they don't look for how do I go ahead and harden this as much because there's not a huge return on investment, right? For those smaller, less capable satellites. And we saw what is it like, I think like a year ago, year and a half ago, something like that. I think they lost like 54 of them based off of, some kind of solar perturbation or something like that. And that's easy for them. They just go ahead and throw up another, a couple hundred, right? And so, but when you look at Space Force capabilities, utilizing those capabilities, I think we need to do that, tying into that commercial sector more. But our capabilities right now that are on orbit, I think a lot more of them are more hard into that kind of stuff. So, do you got time for one more?
Yeah, let's do
All
it.
right. What research is needed for helping the Space Force and identifying space weather disturbances?
Ooh, that one gets a little bit outside of my area of expertise. From what I understand, we do have pretty good capabilities to be able to help identify that. It's just kind of working through, like I said, we always go through a root cause analysis for any anomalies that we see, and we're usually able to understand the space domain, weather environment, to be able to decide whether or not it was that. But I can't confidently speak on that, unfortunately. Trench, you got
Yeah,
any?
I think we've had a lot of time, a lot of decades of time with our satellites on orbit, and seeing what all those different perturbations and the effects on our satellites are, so that we can, better understand. And if we have some kind of anomaly on board, you can usually look at past data and analyze that and say, this is likely, a perturbation or something like that, and not necessarily nefarious. And we also do a lot of testing too, right? Before we even launch satellites, we do a lot of, testing with solar weather and, and space weather in general, just to make sure that we understand what those effects will look like. Because once it's up there, there's really no changing it, right? So maybe we're moving in that direction to be able to service on orbit capabilities. But for the most part, once it's there, it's there. So you got to do a lot of rigorous testing in order to make sure that you know how that system's going to react in that environment. And, it's kind of funny because we do some of that here at, Space Institute. So we have vacuum chambers and things like that, where we can test some of those capabilities of the satellite and the understanding of what it's going to look like and how it's going to interact, and the coatings on it and stuff like that in a vacuumed environment. So, all right, well, you know what? I think we're about at that time, and I don't see any more questions right now that are pressing. I will answer a few more questions at the end here that we got via the registration that Anita will tee up for me. But first of all, I just want to, thank you so much, man. John, you're a great friend of mine, always will be. I appreciate you being here. Great mentor as well. You have a super busy schedule. I'm going to let you get out of here so you can go cut that ribbon and get those Guardians in some seats and doing some of that analysis. But thank you for bringing your expertise and connecting with the University of Tennessee, Knoxville and the Space Institute teams. It's really, we really appreciate what you guys and the Intel Guardians are doing on a daily basis. So, and make sure you tell them all that I said hello, okay? And I still miss them.
I absolutely will do that. Thanks so much again, Trench. Good luck to everybody in this course, and I hope you all do well. And if there's any other questions that pop up for me, Trench, you know how to get a hold of me, and just send them my way. But with that, thanks, guys. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll chat with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Colonel Vincent. All right. So I think that was fantastic, right? So again, a perspective that you don't normally get every day when you look at these kind of environments and what the Space Force is doing. Just being able to interact with an active duty Guardian who's going to tell you as much as he possibly can is, I think, invaluable. And so this is some of the stuff that we talked about today. I tried to pull the thread on a little bit more of that to give you some more detail. Again, it's kind of hard to tell you everything, right? Because it's still an unclassified environment. But I think we have a few questions that we got via chat. So Anita, do you want to tee up some of those, and I'll try to answer those as best I can?
Yep, sure. So how does the concept of space deterrence play a role in preventing hostile actions between countries in space?
Ooh, okay. That's a fantastic question. So let's look at deterrence in general first, right? So that refers to the idea of having credible capabilities and the willingness to use that capability. The idea is that if potential adversaries understand that a nation has both the power to defend its space assets and the resolve to act when necessary, they're probably going to be deterred from attacking or disrupting those assets. Knowing that, the consequences could be severe, right? So essentially, the deterrent effect, it really relies on adversaries' perception of both potential cost of aggression and some kind of certainty of retaliation. However, the way that different countries view escalation of warfare often varies based on their military doctrines, strategic cultures, historical experiences, geopolitical priorities, you name it, right? And so each nation really has its own approach to escalation, and how they kind of respond to conflict or perceived threat will kind of depend on various factors like their military capabilities, maybe what alliances they have, and the risk that's involved in furthering any kind of confrontation. I'll give you a couple examples real quick. So we talk about Russia and China, right? So for instance, Russia, they see escalation as both a tactical and a strategic tool in warfare, especially given their history in facing external threats. So they view escalation as a way to compel an adversary to de-escalate. And they intend to employ different levels of force in order to achieve those political objectives. But in contrast, China historically tends to view escalation with caution. And they kind of emphasize strategic patience, avoiding open confrontation unless absolutely necessary. China also seeks to control escalation, and they escalate only when there's some kind of like clear advantage in terms of their military or political outcomes. So hopefully that answers that question, kind of.
I think so. Yep. I'm not sure. I'm guessing this will be something that you can answer, but if not, we'll defer it. But
Yep.
How do we fill gaps in the polar regions?
In the polar region. So there are different ways to do that. So in low Earth orbit, you have the ability to change to launch a satellite with a different inclination and get some coverage over the polar regions. And so we do that with lots of different satellites. But also there's a specific orbit, it's in a highly elliptical orbit, or it's called a Molaniya orbit. And that's where you have a very long dwell time. Your apogee is very far away from the Earth, apogee, and your perigee is very close to the bottom of the pole, or vice versa. And so what that does is, as you're going up to your apogee point, you start to slow, and you have a lot more coverage over that area, the polar regions, than you would in other orbits.
Okay. And the next question, sorry, my screen has decided to do some weird things. How does civilian space, NASA, in quotes, fit into this picture, or does it?
Ooh, so that's kind of out of my expertise as well. So I haven't done a whole lot with NASA. I know they do a lot of research and development. They have some spin-off technologies that they develop that the DoD will then take and utilize for other technologies. But I'm sorry, Reginald, that kind of gets out of my expertise. So I don't want to speak too much on that and tell you the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's fair. Next question. What is the latest research and development efforts aimed at developing advanced satellite defense technologies to protect against anti-satellite weapons?
Okay, yeah. So talking research and development, the university and some of the stuff that we potentially could be looking at. So it's a very interesting question. I've done some open source research on this recently, actually. So some of the things that we're exploring in R&D is maneuverable satellites. So being able to design satellites with built-in thrusters or more built-in thrusters or reaction wheels to allow them to change orbits quickly to evade any kind of incoming ASAT. Also, I think there's some research being done on stealth technology. So looking at new materials and coatings that can be put onto satellites to reduce the satellite's radar cross-section, making it harder to detect and target, especially when you start looking out in geo. Also some active protections, right? So systems that are being developed to detect incoming threats, either deflect or neutralize those threats as well. First off, quite a bit of, I think, advanced R&D is focused on improving space-based sensors to identify and track missile threats earlier in their trajectory, and throughout their engagement envelope in general, to provide some extra decision space for senior leaders, which will also enable faster response times for defensive systems, thus increasing their effectiveness as well. Also, countries are researching interceptor missiles that could be deployed from space to target and destroy incoming missiles or space-based weapons before they even reach Earth. Additionally, there's some research into laser systems or particle beams that are capable of targeting and neutralizing missiles in space. I know that's gaining a lot of momentum as well. These systems, they really offer a potential shield against some space-based missile threats. Hopefully that kind of answers that question.
I think so. And feel free to chime in if you all have, follow-up questions to anything, but we'll keep moving along. What role does, did we already just, no, we did. What role does research and development play in developing more resilient space communication systems that can withstand jamming or signal interference from hostile nations?
All right, let me think about this one for a second. I mean, so R&D plays a critical role in ensuring the resilience of space-based communication systems, right? So I think some of the strategies that are being explored, they kind of involve quantum key distribution and other advanced encryption methods, just to make that communication impossible or less likely to be intercepted or jammed. Also, I mean, frequency hopping is a big one, and spread spectrum. So taking those communication systems that can dynamically change frequencies are being developed in order to not only avoid detection, but also the jamming attempts. So if you can't put noise on the frequency where I'm at, or I'm constantly moving, then it becomes harder for you to target my system. And another one I think is, so we see this too, right? We talk about proliferated LEO, so satellite mesh networks. So any kind of new constellations that work together to almost instantaneously reroute communications in the event of a jammed link are also being researched, just to make sure that they can provide continuous communications to their users.
Okay. And then last question, what role does advanced simulation technologies play in preparing for and countering potential space warfare scenarios? And how are they being incorporated into research and development?
Advanced simulation technologies incorporating R&D. Okay, so modeling and simulating, right? So it's incredibly important. Models and sims are incredibly important in the live, virtual, and constructive environment, and also wargaming, because they provide a safe, cost-effective, and flexible way to not only test but train and evaluate strategies, tactics, system performance without the risk and the expense of real-world operations. I think model and simulation also, it really allows military to simulate high-risk scenarios that would obviously be too dangerous or impractical to conduct in real life. They also offer flexibility to design a wide range of scenarios as well that can be scaled though too, right? Which is really important, being able to scale a scenario from small tactical operations up to a large-scale strategic engagement. Let's see, live, virtual, constructive environments can also, one of the key pieces of that is they can also mix real and simulated elements together, which then allow for a broad range of engagements from that small unit level training all the way up to the joint or coalition exercises with those more complex kind of scenarios that involve multiple domains. So think, land, sea, air, space, cyber, all together. Also, one of the big, huge advantages is that in live training, once an exercise is complete, there's often like a limited opportunity based on a person's memory for any kind of in-depth analysis or event reconstruction for to identify what went wrong, what went right, best practices, what could we have done differently, right? And even then, a lot of that data that's collected is subjective in nature. So, but in contrast, when you start talking about modeling and simulating these kind of engagements, they provide the ability to collect data throughout the exercise, right? And it really enables like that detailed and that data-rich information that can be fed into like an after action report. And then we can really, get down into it and identify mistakes. We can refine our strategies. We can improve performance for future engagements by capturing that objective and that unbiased data. All right. I think that kind of answered that.
Yeah, and I think that was the last question, and we're right at about time.
Okay.
Unless anyone has any other questions,
right,
I'll hand it back over to, or not hand it back over, but Stephen, I'll go on mute and let you wrap it up.
Okay, so I'll leave you guys with this quote from the first Chief of Space Operations, right, General Raymond. So I'm convinced that in the future, if we're going to get into a conflict, we're going to have to fight and win for space superiority. So needless to say, we've talked about this over the last couple of weeks. Space is essential to our security and our way of life, right? So as threats in the domain continue to grow, it's more important than ever that we stay ready to protect our interest, right? So maintaining that dominance in space is not just about military defense. It's also about securing our future and your research and development efforts really at the Institute. And we got a lot of other partners on here. It's really integral to this entire effort. And so I'll leave you at that, but I want to give you guys some more resources too, right? So I've included a few of the sources that I used to prepare this briefing to make sure that it stayed unclassified, along with some additional reading material for everyone who's kind of interested in a deeper dive into these topics. The resources, they just offer more detail and context that further expand on some of the key points that we briefed today. And then I just want to say that I think at our peak, we had somewhere around 50 participants. So I really hope that you found the second part of the series like really interesting. I think the threat is most interesting to me usually because it makes it real. It drives it home. It lets me understand like, why do I care about what we're doing and what is our adversary doing out there that you don't see in the general public, right? And so I'm really excited for you guys to be part of this, but I'm also excited for you to be part of the next session, which is on February 21st, where we'll dive into how the Space Force is adapting to tackle some of the challenges that we talked about today. And we're going to bring in our guest speaker, who's the Deputy Director of Space Futures Command Task Force, Colonel Lincoln Bonner, who is a UTSI grad as well, probably one of the most well-educated people I've ever met in my life. So I'll leave you with that. I think Anita is also going to send out a survey to all the participants afterwards. So if you can please take the time to fill out that survey for us, we really appreciate it so that we can make sure that we're incorporating your feedback for the next 2 sessions that we're going to have. And then I'll just thank you guys for attending. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks so much for being